Hi everyone. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on wherever you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining in. Um, Welcome to HackerEarth's panel discussion, more of a dialogue rather, on this very important topic of how to champion diversity, equity, and inclusion. And on that note, I'm gonna just take some time to share a personal story before I go on and introduce to our lovely panel over here, right? For you now, um, when I was on the topic that we are talking about today, right? Repeatedly, I think there's a lot of conversation going on inclusion and diversity. I think personally, I've been asked a few times by multiple people saying, Shweta, don't you think do you think like there's a lot of conversation happening around this topic today? Do we really need to do so much? I've had questions from a few people even coming to me saying, hey, don't you think it's a very personal, it's quite personal to someone, right? And someone even used the word of, it's a very personal agenda. Do you really want to get that into workspace or bring that into workspace, right? And while there were initial emotions that got triggered in me, I said, you know what, why not? I'm going to sit down with it with my cup of coffee sometime. I reflected on it. Um, and every time when I've done that exercise, when the answer has always been no, no, the dialogue needs to go on. There is no two questions about it. Um, I think, and I want to just call out 2 points that in my reflection that kind of stood out to me, more in terms of how the whole language around inclusion and diversity has evolved over a period of time. I think the first one being earlier from the words being of diversity and inclusion, mainly, and as a majority practice, being on the basis of equality, right? And today, where we have the word equity here, even in the topic. So we have the word equity with us. And I personally am so proud that I'm using it and a lot of the other people are using it, because I've been in a space where I've been carried away with equality. I've even questioned sometimes when I was earlier doing one of the initiatives and creating a program for developing women in the tech world, a program only for women, right? And I've been questioned saying, hey, don't the men need to have this too? Is it like a privilege? Are we discriminating, right? And I'm like, oh, I've even had the thought saying, if we're doing it for the women, then we need to probably do it for the men. And also coming from my own personal bias of being a woman, I'm like, yeah, so am I not doing something right? Do we need to always include the men in the journey too? And then I realized it's not about equality. The word is equity, right? Which means it's okay, not it's okay. We must actually kind of direct extra resources wherever needed to underrepresented groups, and get them and get us to a space of equality eventually out there, right? So the first one that kind of stood out to me over there. And the second one being that I'm really glad that, again, the whole journey has evolved from being very external as a majority practice. I think what we saw in the initial days was a lot of companies started having verticals and chapters on diversity and inclusion. A lot of D&I roles started emerging, dedicated roles, you know. I think it was great. It was great to kind of see that, and we need to start somewhere, right? I'm just happy that the whole conversation has again moved and evolved to a space where today we are moving into a conversation where we're saying that, listen, inclusion is personal. D&I is all about human beings, of humans, right? So, and that's exactly where the conversation needs to start. You're talking about me out here in your whole D&I umbrella. So you start the conversation with me and then you take it out. So I like how, as the theme is kind of moving towards inside out. And I love that about it, right? So the journey has been evolving. And again, going back to the question where someone asked, do we really need to do this? I think we really need to do this. I think we really need to continue to do this because it's a dialogue which is continuous. It's not a one-time activity that needs to be done once as an action, then stop. Yeah, we need to continue to do this, and we will continue to do this. On that note, we have, I think we have a brilliant set of panelists over here, coming from very, very diverse backgrounds, both personally and professionally. And Charles, Madison, Erica, and Elena, I'm going to request you to please, if you can give a short introduction about yourselves, because I wouldn't do justice if I was to try and do that. So over to you, over to you. Charles, if you want to go first.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Rita. And thank you very much for having me actually on the panel today. Really excited about this. My name is Charles Roux. I'm the head of recruitment for Europe, so Europe, Middle East, and Africa at a company called IHS Markit. So IHS Markit is a 15,000 wide employees company. It's a leading information firm. So essentially what we do is that we leverage technology and data science to provide insights, but also software and data to help our customers make better decisions. So when I say data science, last year we've hired in Europe around 850 so new employees, new colleagues, and a large portion of those 850 people were coming from tech background, data science background. So that's experience actually, especially focusing on D&I, led us to get actually a couple of findings that I will be sharing today with you. But again, thank you for having me today.
Thank you, Charles.
Hello, my name is Maddie. I am the VP of People and Impact at Grav. So my whole role focuses around social justice in the cannabis space. I am also a Black queer woman, and in my spare time, I do a lot of education on intersectionality and anti-racism. I live in Austin, Texas, but I'm currently coming to you from Rhode Island.
Hello. My name is Erica Mosley, and I am the founder of TechT. I will consider myself as a multicultural talent. So I'm coming in from a diverse background and actually started founder of TechT so that way I can be able to help individuals break into tech. I knew how hard it was to break into tech. Luckily, I live here in San Francisco, California, and now I'm bridging the gap with all the tech companies around the world. And I'm excited for you guys to learn from all the panels and ask questions, etc. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Most notable for this conversation, I'm the co-founder of a workplace filmmaking company, and we exist to capture the humanity of work through stories that matter, primarily through the power of film. So a lot of the work that we get to do with companies really all around the world is to really help to tell this story and tell the story of DEI in the most authentic way to that company and to its people. I also am the co-founder of a nonprofit called Mezgla Media Collective, which is a community now over 600 women of color, non-binary filmmakers here in Chicago and beyond. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And my name is Shweta Harikrishnan. I lead the people team or the HR team for HackerEarth. Also a queer woman from the community, and involved in leading a support group with a group of other people that we kind of created, and it's been in existence for about 10, 12 years for now. Oh, so yeah, and from India. Yeah. On that note, welcome again to everyone out here. Oh, great. Slides have gone out. Great. All right, cool. So before I think I'm excited and really looking forward to, hearing your views on a few of the questions that I would love to ask you out here. Before that, and for our audience, I think a few notes that I'm going to share with you. So you can, while in conversation, feel free to kind of drop in your questions specifically in the Q&A comment box so that I don't miss it, we don't miss it, and we'll try as much as possible to pick out your questions and get everyone to answer them for you. You can specifically ask someone out here taking the name if you want to specifically ask them on a particular question or direct the question to them. We're going to be running 1 or 2 polls. And my colleague Sam, who's in the background, very kindly is going to help me with that. right? As and when we progress through the discussion, we will have some time dedicated towards the end of the session towards Q&A, apart from whatever you place on the box over here. And yeah, and you will also have a survey coming at the end, which I will reiterate again, because we would love your feedback on how you felt about this session, okay? Okay, cool. On that note, I think we could to start. All right, this is my favorite question, and I would love to hear actually each of your point of view on it. Definition of diversity and inclusion. How do you define diversity and inclusion? Who would want to go first? Charles, why don't you go first?
Sure, absolutely. So I think we have looked into putting definitions and putting words basically behind diversity and inclusion within the company. We have tried actually to be as broad as possible, and actually working on principles such as that any applicant, any individual has the ability to enter organization, to actually develop their skills and develop their competence and actually follow a great journey within the organization the same way any other individual would have. So it's really the complete equity of the recruitment process with the development process as well. We are talking also about equality also of chances in terms of using and leveraging the internal tools to grow a career within an organization. So diversity for us, it's really about also having employees really who are also a good reflection of the local pool of candidates. We want actually to be reflective of who are the people actually in the country where we hire, because diversity for us, it's not really like just one definition for every country. Every country will have actually different type of set of challenges and would be reflecting differently. So the inclusion piece, it's really about getting every segment of the population including involved really in decisions, in actually the organization of the company. We don't want to leave anyone out. And these are really like the fundamental principle around attracting candidates, but also developing also employees and helping them growing actually within the organization.
Got it. Thanks, Charles. So what I'm hearing is, and I think basically what I'm hearing is that, I think you are putting different levers of basically having every person kind of included, even in the decision-making process and etc., all of that. So inclusion being the key out there, looking at the mix of people that you have and having a voice included out there. Okay.
Absolutely. I think also we'll talk about that probably later. Affinity groups, for example, are like a really key components of our D&I approach. We are huge promoters of internal affinity groups. Everyone should be able actually to develop actually their own network within the organization, also defend their own opinion within the organization as well. And this is really like inclusion for us.
Okay. Got it. Erica, how would you define D&I?
So it is exactly what Charles said, but you just have to just narrow it down. So I'm coming from a multicultural perspective, a non-traditional perspective, Black and tech perspective, right? So I'm just going to narrow it down from that area first, like your consumer base, when they think about diversity and inclusion. So for me and Black people, they think diversity and inclusion actually means Black. You get the community, they just think it means that everyone's included, etc. You just get, that's what diversity and inclusion means. So when I go out to the community and I say I'm a diversity and inclusion rep, and I help people get into tech, and they're like, oh, I'm Black, I can get into it too. And I'm like, no, that's not what diversity and inclusion means. So From a consumer basis, that means that, you know, you're a diverse perspective. Coming from me, as far as breaking into tech, I have learned that diversity is just basically a group of diverse panels. It's not about color, it's not about race. It can be a cat, a dog, and a rat. That's basically diverse, right? And then inclusion is if you include it in the party, right? So for example, if was I included in a party? So the first thing I'm going to do is, when I was invited to this panel, I said, okay, and is this a diverse group? All right, I see Madison on here. I see that she does look like me, but again, we're not the same, but we are represented in the same group. And it goes back what Charles said, that you can't put diversity into a whole one area. So I feel like I was included with that due to the fact that it's a diverse panel. It's not about color or anything, but it's a diverse panel. And then included, I feel like I'm included into this panel. I feel like I'll be able to give my thoughts on birth perspective. So that's why I feel like diversity and inclusion really is into the tech world. But when you go into the tech world, diversity and inclusion is really something else. Diversity and inclusion is basically their type of diverse groups. So you have to look at the tech companies that you're looking for. So for example, if I wanted to go to a tech company that I call My Eyes, I need to see if My Eyes is a diverse group. They say they're looking for diversity and inclusion. What does diversity and inclusion actually means to them? Does diverse means only all white women or just women per se? Because that is diverse group again, right? I probably want all women with different race. That is diverse. And then I want all women to be included in the panel. So you need to make sure that whenever you go to a tech company, you need to analyze what diversity and inclusion actually means to them. And equity is a different topic, but we're just talking about diversity and inclusion. And that's how I break it down from the consumer perspective, as far as me breaking into tech. And when you actually get into the tech world, what diversity and inclusion actually means in tech. And I'm Erica, and I'm done speaking.
Thanks, Erica. Madison?
For sure. So for me, I actually focus pretty heavily on inclusion, and inclusion is more than being invited to the decision-making table. It's more than being asked to show up. For me, inclusion is psychological safety at its fullest, meaning I feel like I can show up as whoever I am and not be putting my job or my reputation at risk. And so often we are asked to join the table, but we're asked to water ourselves down and be a different person. And for me, that's not the same thing as inclusion. That's just asking for the optics of it. We need a Black person to put on our career page. We need a Black person so that when people look at our LinkedIn, we look diverse. And being diverse has never been about the optics. It's been about the perspective. And like Erica said, Eric and I may share a hue or a skin tone, but that does not mean we are the same. And so often we think about diversity as groups and monoliths, as if all Black people fall into a bucket and then LGBTQ fall into a bucket, but we don't talk about when those people are the same person. And so for me, so much of diversity and inclusion is having an understanding, not only for your population, but for your product, that works for the most marginalized person. Because if it works for the most marginalized person, it's going to work for everyone. And that is internally, externally. And for me, that is the most important thing that I can focus on, is that diversity and inclusion has to look like psychological safety and accessibility.
Interesting. Okay. Thank you for that, Madison. And I hear you when you say that don't invite one part of me. It's much more, and there's a whole lot more to it. Right. And the word that comes into my mind also, maybe we'll touch upon a little later in the discussion, or maybe not, intersectionality also there, right, on that aspect of it. Okay. Elena, what's your view?
I'm going to keep this real short. We should start seeing DEI as verbs. Diversity is to invite. Equity is to provide access. But more importantly, inclusion is to connect, is to belong, and is to matter. We have to make people feel like they matter and they can show up as their authentic selves. And so really inevitably why we have people stay in our organizations, because they truly feel like they belong and that they can be their most authentic selves. So we should, I think inevitably it's seeing DEI as verbs and changing our definitions to what are the actions for us.
Okay. Thank you. And I'm just gonna summarize this, for our audience out here, just the key points and the words and the themes that we are hearing from here, right? I think largely also we hear that, okay, diversity is the mix, inclusion is to make that mix work. We spoke about, it's very important to make someone feel feel included. I think, again, don't restrict, right? Don't get carried away with the norms of the world outside. Sit down and think about, if it's in the tech side of the world or anywhere, actually, sit down about what does this mean to you and why are you doing this? And then start the definition and conversation from there. And also psychological safety, Madison. I think a very, very good point that you pointed out there. Okay, all right.
Yes, I really want to touch on the safety. That's really, really important too as well. We are told that we can come into these panels and talk about diversity and inclusion, but to be honest, I have gotten in trouble for coming to this panel to talk about diversity and inclusion. And at first I was scared to come onto this panel, but I believe that it was really important for me to continue to talk about it, to whereas my job was not acceptable about this panel, but mind you, on the job it says diversity and inclusion. So you have to really be cautious about when you have a diversity and inclusion title on you, because these companies are using diversity and inclusion for clout these days. So you really have to be
and that again brings to the point that we're talking about, right? It's okay that if you don't have diversity and inclusion as a part of your charter, or it's not for everyone. It is really not for everyone. So which means sit down and think about, do you really want to do this? And if you want to do this, if you're using these words, then you have to get that into action too. Yeah. Okay, all right. Thank you for all your points of view on that one. And I think and I think even for the benefit of the audience, I think even at HackerEarth, one thing that we kind of do is keep inclusion. I think in consensus with whatever is mentioned over here. I think what we do is keep inclusion at the heart of anything and everything that we do, and drive based on that, again, inside out mainly, right? And we just interchange the word and use IND rather than DNI, because most often using diversity and inclusion, we see that the eyes falls on a lot of external factors and metric and actions, and you're forgetting about your internal people existing in the first place, and checking in, saying, hey, for your existing people, is the space and the workspace and the environment, does it feel inclusive? Do they feel included already rather than going out? People always talk about hiring in the first place, so I think the intent for us have been always to kind of have the conversation going inside out, right, and start with that approach. Okay, all right. I have a question on the current state of DEI in tech industry. So how would you describe the current state of DEI in the tech industry? And Madison, I'm very curious to know your thoughts on this one, especially because you were there with us in a panel last year when we had it. So how do you think, has things changed, not changed, 2020 versus 2021?
So honestly, I feel like DEI in the tech space is incredibly performative, and it centers on really specific groups of people rather than thinking about everyone. It really centers on the optics. So like, do we look diverse? And like I said before, so many people are doing this for the wrong reasons. And being in a city that is not wildly diverse, Austin sits at less than 8% Black. A lot of it is performative. We currently have like a social justice call to action going on in Austin, and half of the founders who are, funding it have had racist incidents and problems in the past. And so I think for me, the issue is so many companies have the dollars to dump into the PR that goes behind DEI to say we did this event, or hey, look at all of our funding dollars that we donated to Black Lives Matter. but they're not actually thinking about how they're treating their employees internally. And they're also not thinking about like, oh, how does my board look? How do the people actually at the top look? Do they represent the people at the bottom of my organization? Or have I stuck all of my Black and brown folks in customer service and at the bottom of my organization where they can't actually create change? And too often our top leaders in our C-suites want change to come from the bottom. They want it to come from ERG groups who don't have the power or the money to make change because they think that's enough. And for me, that's a problem.
Yeah. I'm going to come back a little later to the group on the leadership aspect of things. You know, you mentioned the power and then how sometimes it needs to be driven from the top. Anyone else want to, go at it? Any views that you have?
I mean, I really see this in two themes. You know, when I think about, the state of tech, it's put on notice. You know, the truth is, we have over 78% of job seekers who are paying attention to the DEI programs at these companies, which means that inevitably society and job seekers are forcing companies to act now, number one. The second thing that we see is that this is still tortoise-paced progress. I mean, if we look at the data from the Google report that they did from 2014 to now, it's still not very much progress.
Yeah.
So I really think what we have to pay attention to what's happening right now is the difference between the amount of investment that is currently happening in DEI and what inevitably the progress will be. I know a lot of seeds are being planted right now, right? We've gone up not exponentially, but certainly from, the number of companies who now have DEI manifestos. That's now at 35%. Prior to pre-2020, that was 11%. So I think we're seeing things happening in investment, but I think we still need to probably have a bit more time to understand how this all is starting to fall out, because I think that there is a big difference between investment and progress.
Yeah. And I don't even know if you're in a position to really kind of spot the problems out there, because even I was looking at the report and it's pretty much the movement is there, which is just very, very minuscule in terms of if you kind of look at how the progression has happened on the D&I conversation and the investments and, what visibly is out there from an inclusion perspective, and then how you see the needle moving in the tech side of the world, right? I look at the data still shows that, okay, we still have while that's increasing, a lower pool of people even available to us from the sourcing point of view out there. So, I think we are yet to, I don't know if anyone has any different views, but I think we are yet to spot the problem.
I want to say, I really can say that I really do see the change as far as diversity and inclusion. Like, I live here in San Francisco, and again, there's opportunities. You got boot camps, you got apprenticeships, you have these new DEI rules. You see Twitter is going to Africa. You have a lot of there's a lot of organizations that's giving funds to nonprofits, etc. So yes, I do see that as far as the diversity and inclusion, but it goes back to the multicultural branding. How are you connecting to your consumers? So tech companies only use 1% of their branding to actually to their consumers to figure out how you can connect to us. So here's what tech companies says, I can't find diverse candidates. I can't do this, I can't do that. But are you using the same languages? What are you only using 1% of your branding for multicultural branding, which is a $3 trillion brand, right? So how are you branding to them? Are you going, this is the reason why I started Tech Tea. Because it's just all these tech companies are just saying, I can't find these diverse candidates. Now I just have this platform and I said, here's all the diverse candidates. What is the reason why you're not hiring them now? You're not branding to them in different things. And this is the reason why they need to know where tech companies is at. So if you're branding to Oakland and you're saying that I have so many apprenticeships and you're having television shows on probably like BET or public access televisions, etc., you're going to get more talent. Why? Because you're branding out to these individuals. But if you're continue talking amongst each other, the clubhouse and meetings, etc., you're never going to get diverse candidates. Why? Because we're never going to be in that area. Luckily for me, again, I live in San Francisco. I live here around techies. I can communicate with you guys on a one-on-one. But if I didn't have that atmosphere and I was living in South Carolina, I would have no idea that diversity and inclusion is actually changing all these boot camps, all these apprenticeships, all these DEI roles. But due to the fact that you're not branding to the correct people and only using 1% of the $3 trillion that we have, it's never, the language barrier is where it's at.
Yeah. Charles, do you have any point of view over here? Also, I mean, in addition to what Erica is saying, and then how the needle has been moving on that spectrum there.
Yeah, true. I think as Madison was saying, a lot of tech companies kind of like reacted on the back of the murder of George Floyd last year. And all of a sudden we saw actually on the market a whole flurry of, head of D&I roles actually at, large firms. And basically everyone was really like, fighting basically to have, a D&I person, actually head of D&I within their organization. And I think this is obviously an important step, but this is actually very far from really being able to achieve anything in D&I. Now, I think, companies are probably going to do better, especially when it comes to, for example, some European markets as well, where governments are asking companies actually to collect and share, gender, but also race and socioeconomic data, with a view of later on also imposing, like basically quota, not only actually globally within the organization, but also actually with board members as well. I think it started obviously like in France, a lot of Nordic countries as well. I mean, these companies will have actually a huge incentive really to do better very quickly actually when it comes to D&I, because otherwise it's going to hurt their bottom line. I think, when I'm looking also at the cycle of tech companies, again, like the murder of George Floyd last year was really a big accelerator in thinking about D&I and in inclusiveness as well. I think a lot of companies have opened up, I think, discussions among themselves around okay, what really does it mean? How can we be more inclusive as well? And I think a few other things actually I've heard also, like especially from Erica, there are going to be more firms in the market of helping companies, especially tech companies, being better at D&I. If you're looking at like 5 years ago, every tech company would go on campus and be saying like, yes, we are very friendly to Black community or underrepresented actually segment of the population. But still, they were still trying to tap the same kind of universities and the same type of source as they've done actually before. Whereas actually all the partners now who are able actually to connect with, for example, like, Black professionals and get them actually into tech because they have great network in other universities that are not actually in the A list of tech companies. There is really like, great opportunity here, because those firms will be able actually to link up, that talent pool and the willingness of companies, especially tech companies, to do more. But I think there is also, I think a lot of tech companies are now actually at the end of the cycle of, yes, we want to do better in D&I, and then they're looking at their data and the data hasn't changed. And now they are like, okay, hold a second, actually, there is something that we're not doing right. So what is that we are not doing right? Mm-hmm. And I think we are starting that new cycle where now we're going to look into the data. We're going to look into also leveraging the partnership with those great companies that have actually the right network to get those people inside the firm.
Right. Would I be right in saying that the intent has increased a lot? The impact probably has not,
I would say yes and no. For me, it's really frustrating to know that it had to take a Black man having to become a martyr that he didn't want to be in order for people to realize that Black people experience barriers. And for me, that's a lot of what inclusion is as well, is understanding the barriers your population faces. And that's different for everyone. And the barriers you have compile with the more identities that intersect for you. And so, although I guess the intent was there, it's incredibly frustrating to know that someone had to be murdered on live television for us to get there.
Yeah.
Because this isn't the first Black man that's been murdered by police, but this one just happened to be televised, so it mattered more. And for me, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah, yeah. And thanks for putting that point of view out there, Madison. I think it's difficult to listen to and put the spotlight onto, but I think it is a fact in the reality of things. Madison, one of the points that you kind of mentioned earlier, and I'm going to place the next question on that, senior leadership at the top. Tech leaders, right? Again, my question is around what do you think tech leaders can do to improve and prioritize their D&I efforts from the top? Views on that?
For sure. So I think there's two things. One of the things I struggle with hardest when I'm consulting is the ability to look in the mirror to see how you yourself have caused harm within your own organization. Our culture and our power dynamics within our organization are shaped by our top leaders. And if you have not taken the time to look in the mirror and unpack your biases, chances are they have trickled down into your organization somehow. Like Erica said, there's never been a pipeline problem. It's been how we've decided what top talent looks like. And so if top talent is only Stanford or Harvard, and you never look at an HBCU, you've actually basically decided that top talent is like 90% white. And for me, that's a problem. And so often that's the hardest part is DEI work is not just organizational work. It is self-work. It is personal work. Because if I cannot call myself out on the BS that I have learned from society, then I damn sure can't do it in my organization. And so that is the part that leaders struggle with, because you have to come to terms with the harm that you've caused, even if the intent wasn't behind it. I think very few of us intend to cause harm. But we do, especially when we don't have an understanding of our own privileges. And the only way that we can actually leverage our privilege and power is by understanding where we've actually used them to cause harm. I think the second part is always, we get this question as consultants is like, oh my God, what's the ROI on this? And sometimes it's like, there is no ROI on being a good person. Sometimes it actually costs you money. Sometimes you got to spend money. And so a lot of that is like, okay, if we're thinking equity and we want everyone to have a pay structure that makes sense, guess what? Sometimes that takes financial injections, and I can't go promise you that that's going to make you money. Of course, it may help your retention and you make more money there, but sometimes you just have to say like, hey, we want to do the right thing by everyone in our organization. And as an organizational leader, I can't necessarily put a dollar amount on what that looks like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Elena, any views that you have on this?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to add to that. Look, we have 6 human primal fears. One of them is fear of criticism, right? And I think oftentimes leaders are afraid to be vulnerable, number one. Which becomes a huge challenge. And then certainly I think part of the reason why leaders may not lean in is because they are afraid of making those mistakes, and quite frankly, often publicly. And so as a result, it is much easier for them to hone in on side. And that's just a kind of a human instinct general, but absolutely, it absolutely has to come from the top. It absolutely has to say from leaders, I don't know what I don't know. Acknowledge that, truly. And then I think it really then comes down to a couple of key things. We're seeing this, and, to Madison's point, it is hard to really distinguish those that are performative and those that are authentic, but inevitably comes down to, look, we first have to build the company mindset to what this means for us. And that's having the vision. And you can call it your DEI manifesto, whatever it is, but it's really starting to lay that out. And then certainly, yes, we have to learn how we measure that. We have to start making ourselves accountable to that. And certainly there's been a huge increase in the amount of surveys and data reports where leaders are now being held accountable to certain measurements based on the projects that they have done. And even more so when we think about inclusion, when we think about how it's not just about hiring, it's about retaining. We think specifically about some of the data for BIPOC around what are they really looking for in companies? It's opportunities and development. And so for a long time, tech did not prioritize that, or certainly only for the selected few, where it was very opaque to understand how you'd grow. And so we've seen huge increases from pre-2020 to now, of again, companies being put on notice to now the tune of 35% of tech companies who now are instituting professional development opportunities and being a lot more transparent about how you move up in these roles. Because if you are not going to provide a path for development opportunities and be transparent around that, you're not only going to lose candidates who are interested in understanding what that is, the people that are staying will absolutely leave.
Right.
I'd also say that I think we start this too late in the game. I work primarily with startups who are like Series A through D. And somehow we start thinking about this at Series C when we've already got 200 people and we're like, oh my God, we hired the same 200 person. Like we hired 200 of the exact same people in like different versions of a Patagonia vest. Now what? And so I think leaders have to start thinking about this as soon as they're thinking about their
company of one. Company of one.
Yes.
These startup accelerators, like when we think about all these Fakakta startup accelerators, whatever, these founders should be going through just as much, how do I pitch to a VC, as much as they are learning about how am I creating an inclusive culture from the get. And that's something that's not being prioritized.
And prioritize researching your VC and where they sit on all of these issues, because they're going to dictate so many of your decisions that even if you genuinely give a damn, but your VC does not, now what? Guess what? You don't give a damn now either because you can't.
And when you start late, oh, sorry, Erica, I'm just going to.
No, go ahead.
I was just saying that when you start late is when the whole catch-up game starts, isn't it? Oh, we're only so much. Oh, we're only so much. And you put more money into it and effort into it, rather than if we start from day zero and with that one person, Elena, like how you were talking about. Erica, you were saying something.
Yeah, I just think it's a language barrier again when it comes to the leadership roles. So, for example, when it comes to diversity and inclusion, the role is actually HR. It's not coming in with your experience as far as diversity and bringing background your experience, Madison. So, what that means is a lot of the people, they leave that job because it's just HR and they start their own roles and being their own consultants, so where they can be able to really help tech companies with diversity and inclusion. So what happens is a tech company, they hire a diversity and inclusion leader that have 7 years of experience with HR, and then they come to this panel talking about diversity and inclusion, and they're like, and then they're making the company look bad. And then people are like, I thought you was about diversity and inclusion. No, I'm really an HR individual. All I do is really hire. I don't know anything about Black individuals or any type of culture backgrounds. I'm just an HR based on the language of the description. So that's what I had to figure out as well when because I have a television show here on Channel 29. I was reaching out to diversity and inclusion reps, and they said, I don't have any idea about that. So I'm like, wait, diversity and inclusion is not about bringing the culture into tech companies. So that's the language barrier with there. And then as far as with the gatekeepers are really focused on diversity and inclusion within. I want to make sure we are included within, which is great. We got to make sure we're working good as well. But the gatekeepers are thinking about that. So when you have someone reaching out like me or one of my talents reaching out, that's not our focus right now. We already have 200 people in our team that we have to get together with a diversity and inclusion, because we're about to fail right now. So we can't include you right now because we have this 200 people. And then the leaders, they're not focusing on sourcing the candidates, right? They're not figuring out, hey, can I go out to the community? Can I do that? No, I cannot do that because I have HR experience. I don't have the community experience. So no, I can't go to Oakland. No, I can't go to Texas. No, I can't go to none of those places. Yes, I'm diversity and inclusion, but I do not have that experience. So why the retention is so high is because they're saying that diversity and inclusion is not really diversity and inclusion. So what I'm gonna do is start my own roles and then work with the tech companies. And when you guys are ready, then I can be able to help you. So that way that I can help with my safety as well when I go into these panels, if that makes sense.
I would even say for me, and I say this as someone who works in HR has gatekept diversity for so long because HR is a hot mess. And we hired way too many people into HR who do not have the lens to be working with people. And we hired too many people who wanted to spend all of their time protecting the business instead of protecting their people. And for me, that's such a problem in this world. And like, I end up in HR Twitter and it gives me heartburn because of that. And I have a really hard time calling myself an HR practitioner because of it. HR has really been a harmful thing to DEI efforts for decades. And especially now, they are still the gatekeepers of what this should look like. And most of them don't know anything about DEI. They just got kind of pulled into this because it's hip and it's a buzzword without actually knowing what the hell they're doing. And that's pretty problematic and harmful.
And it's overwhelming to them too. And it's not unfair as well. It's overwhelming for them as well.
You know,
I feel like a lot of companies, I feel like a lot of companies either pulled in HR to be DEI, or they pulled in a Black person who was looking for a career switch and they were like, here, you do this thing. You're Black, you should get it. When in actuality, like, not every Black person wants to come to work and talk about their societal trauma every day. That's not all of us. And some of us aren't interested in being the DEI lead for our team. It feels very tokenized and also harmful and gross.
You know, that brings me to the point. Again, so we are kind of talking about, listen, don't put it on a function, don't put it on people because they are in the function of HR. It's unfair. And he said it's also kind of not helping, not supporting what the journey that we are on. So I've been a personal believer of the fact that, you know what, there's a good balance of people and processes and et cetera and all of that. Right now, if you're saying, hey, it's not on the HR function. Now, I think my point of view here is how many such people are there who very naturally know what inclusion means, know what diversity means. Again, I do think it takes some internal work, sit down and reflection, and it needs to be personal and all of that. Now, which means if we assume that, listen, you know, maybe there is a smaller pool of people who very naturally kind of understand this, then is it important to have a D&I strategy in place? Is it important to have a document? And I don't know.
You kind of have to. And unfortunately, for some of these larger institutions, you know, they were created in a time sometimes when we think about the JP Morgans of the world or whatever, at a time of creating a company that was never intended for women or people of color or of anyone of any marginalized identities. And so they're like salmon going up a stream. And they're having to be very much reactive to everything that's happening because of a lot of these pre-existing kind of conditions that were happening. But when we think about just the, you know, the strategy or this, I mean, the one thing we have to remember is that knowledge isn't just power. Knowledge is power when we have a plan. And it's not just going to matter if we can learn everything about DEI. It's not only understanding it and defining it, then it's having a plan for us to execute and then be accountable for. So you kind of have to.
Okay.
The accountability piece is so important. And I think a lot of companies miss this. We put in policies where, go ahead, we have a no tolerance policy. We don't tolerate racism or homophobia. But then Steve over in sales, who's a top performer, is a horrible racist, and we don't hold him accountable because he's a top performer. He makes us money. And so, yes, we need strategy and we need policy, but we also need accountability. We can't only hold certain people accountable when they're not really a high performer or they don't really matter and they're not making us money. Everyone has to be held accountable in the exact same way, no matter where they sit in the organization, how good they are at their job, and how long they've been there.
I think just to supplement on what has been said, I think I agree with everything. I'll give also a voice, for HR. I think it definitely starts with the top leadership. CEO, chairman of any organization needs to be extremely clear about what the expectation of the company should be when it comes to D&I. And again, CEO or chairman of the company needs to be also very vocal and needs to communicate very often on what the expectations are. And in terms of tolerance, in terms of, like what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what the company wants to achieve in terms of, D&I. And the second step to me, once actually the vision of D&I has been set, again, I think getting help from specialized organization around, okay, how do we break that down? Because I think, most large companies have the data, they can collect the data on race, gender, socioeconomic background, but basically, how do we set actually an objective? Once they have set objectives actually by country, region, or function, I think the next step is really about accountability, as everyone agreed on that, but especially on each manager, because the people who are hiring, it's not talent acquisition, it's not really, HR as well, it's really the manager who's making the decision actually to hire that person or promote that person. And they need actually to be all really responsible for either, the lack of diversity of their pipeline, of the recruitment actually pipeline, or actually the fact that they have potentially actually bias when they're looking at, where the next, talents should be coming from. And I think this is really important actually, that to state that the accountability of D&I, it's not, necessarily actually only HR or recruitment, or actually that D&I, head of D&I that we brought actually from another company. And as you said, I think if that person is Black, all the better actually, this is not really like what it should be. I think these are really managers who need actually to make decisions on who they want to hire, how they want to hire the person, and how they want also to promote as well. But based on that vision that the CEO or the chairman would have said, I think it's really, really important. There was a question I think earlier in the chat, and I can't actually find it. Sorry, it was a little bit.
Is it what are your thoughts on white C-suite executives stepping down? Is that the question you're talking about?
So there was actually a question around also top universities and how actually companies actually need to recruit and change actually the way they need to look at candidates and top talent for the future. I think this is bias. I think chairman or CEO of the company, or actually top leaders who are in a leadership position at the moment, they might be actually in their 40s, in their 50s, actually in their 60s, and basically, the mindset that some of those people might have is that, well, great people actually go to great universities and they're top of their university, and therefore we are going actually to kind of do the same and look for the same people where I'm coming from, and that's very, very difficult for them actually to break that cycle. And again, we worked with firms such as London, Wall Street Bound, these kind of organizations actually are here really to help break that cycle. But again, there needs to be some awareness at the very beginning from the top leadership that, yes, we agree that we are going to change the way we want to promote internally. We want to look at, competence. We look at assessment as well. We're going to debias, the assessment, and we really want to make an active, deliberate decision actually to change that process. But without that, I think you can say whatever you want around, yeah, we're going to debias. Actually, we're going to bring those candidates actually in front of managers. If there is no leadership, if there is no actually expectation from the manager that they're going to change the way they're going to assess candidates and bring people in, the rest, anything that happens before, it's really useless, because these people are going to drop out, are being rejected at the time actually they apply for a promotion, at the time actually they apply to get a new job, and it's not going to work out.
Erica, you were going to say something?
Yes, it's just like what Charles just said as far as the beginning. So you remember at the beginning of this panel, we had a picture of diversity and inclusion, and they were literally about I think it was about 15 people on there, a picture of that. You remember when you first go to college and you analyze exactly where you need to be. Oh, I know that I belong with this group. That's the first thing that you do, figure out what group that you belong to. And that's exactly what tech needs to do as well. It needs to be different individuals for diversity and inclusion. So for example, if I'm diversity and inclusion for a Black individual, and Madison is for, LBGQ, and then you got Ellen, she's probably for something else, and then Charles is for something else. When the George Floyd happens and we need a scenario, you can automatically come to me. And then when new employees come, they can automatically go to Erica. As far as Elena as well, when I come into the tech company, that's the first thing I'm going to analyze. And I say, oh, me and her relates. I can see as far as the diversity, me and her together. And I know that this company is really about diversity and inclusion. You guys have that on the picture. You have literally 15 different avenues. So that way a person won't be overwhelmed. So if I am doing George Floyd and all of a sudden an Asian situation come up and then everyone's come up to me saying, oh, Erica, can you do a project about diversity with Asian? How? I don't know anything about that. Yes, I work around them, but I want to be all the way correct to where I speak about this, to where the company can look good too as well. Let's get other Asian individual that's in a diversity inclusion, not someone that's a software developer and talking about Asian. Let's actually get different groups for diversity and inclusion, so that way whenever an employee comes to your organization, they can feel quote unquote included.
Already included.
Already from the beginning, I call it.
Yeah. Okay. Because do you want to just for the audience, and I think there's a lot of good points that you've spoken about here. If you have to kind of leave your last words on, guys, if you want to plan your DI strategy from scratch, these are the things you need to keep in mind as ingredients probably you want to bake into it, or anything that you want to leave our audience with saying, keep these in mind. Just a few minutes on that, and then we can move on to the next question.
Do you want me to start?
Oh, please.
Yeah, good. So there are a couple of things. I think we work internally on putting together a toolbox, a D&I toolbox for our managers, because to us, as we discussed, I think there's really three steps to achieving really D&I in tech. The first one we discussed, it's really about actually having our top leader, basically making a very clear statement of what they want actually to achieve when it comes to D&I. The second step is measuring basically, and then getting some accountability with the top leadership as well. And when we're talking about accountability, it has to be very pragmatic. This is linking pay, compensation, basically incentive to some very specific actually D&I measurement. So you are reaching actually your quota, you're going to get actually a bonus. You don't, well, you're going to have to do much better actually next year. And I think this is really important, actually linking this to performance, D&I as a metric. And again, I think, I would probably expect Madison to say, well, this is very sad actually to have to do that actually to get really to that stage. But I think over the years, plenty of people with good intentions were saying, oh yes, great, we're going to work on D&I. And then at the end of the year, you're looking back and then nothing has changed, or things have changed, but by 1%, one incremental percent, where actually you're looking for 15% or 20%. So you need to be a little bit more deliberate. I think taking responsibility is very important. Measuring things, having systems internally that measure applicants, but also actually gender, race, socioeconomic background of your employees as well. In every country where you can do that, where the local government allow you to do that, I think it's very important. I think we talked also at a granular level about writing inclusive job descriptions. There are plenty of softwares around that will help you. There is a gender decoder, which is free, helps you actually having a gender neutral job description, brings actually more female to the tech world. Use that. There is also other paying softwares such as Textio. We're talking also about being deliberate. Deliberate is not actually just posting a role on mainstream job boards. This is not equity. So you need to be deliberate. You need actually to find the job boards that are actually friendly to the segments of the population that you are targeting as well. And I think it's also about actively reaching out to underrepresented candidates. For years, many people actually in HR and talent acquisition would post roles and then trying actually to make them most inclusive. And then again, after 6 months, look around and say, why are those people actually not applying? Well, maybe they don't know about the company. Maybe actually they don't know about those platforms as well. So you need to be deliberate. We have LinkedIn, LinkedIn doing a direct search for underrepresented population is permitted. You can do that. You can look actually for females, in LinkedIn as well. You have to be very deliberate on that. And I think to me, actually, one of the last few things are leveraging partnerships. I think every firm needs to admit that we don't know everything about D&I. It's not actually because actually you're bringing actually a D&I, head of D&I, actually that all of a sudden you're going to nail it. Bring people being professionals such as, like Madison, such as, Erica to the board, and they're going to tell you actually like, what are the best step actually to get those candidates. We're talking about candidates in tech, for example, Black people in tech. I've heard actually over the years that, we are opening those job adverts, they're not applying. And actually yet when you partner with, SEO London, Wall Street Bound, the firms that, Erica representing as well, all of a sudden, you are finding those candidates. So it's not a question actually of they are not existing. They are existing. They are not actually, for example, coming from the universities that mainstream tech companies would be looking at usually. So we just need actually to leverage those networks, get actually access to those candidates. And I think it's also about assessment. I think assessment, we need to be deliberate in our assessment as well. If it's really about doing all that work for candidates actually to drop out when actually they're getting into the company, this is completely useless. You need actually to have assessment that are completely unbiased, getting those candidates actually to get them into the pipeline, to foster that pipeline, to get them into the company. And then this is not the end of the journey, because many tech companies are bringing actually like those underrepresented actually candidates in. And then, 6 months later, a year later, they drop out, they leave, they move on to another company. Why? Because the culture of the company is not actually something which is, they feel like they would actually be able to grow their career and then be successful in the company as well. So I think this is also not only a question of getting those people in, but also like allowing them really to be themselves and to be also successful in the organization. So that's really be deliberate in D&I.
Thanks, Charles, for that detailed point of view. Does anyone else has any views on, and I think Charles kind of focused very heavily on, I think, how metrics and these actions can support the whole journey of inclusion, right? Any other points of view that you have to kind of add on over here when it comes to DI strategy and metric thereof?
So I think for me, it's really important to not see this work as a mirror. No matter where you sit on the identity spectrum, it is not about liberating just people who look like you or live like you. And I think oftentimes we don't educate ourselves on the barriers for other communities. And that is not only imperative to my allyship, but to my own fight. And so I think for me, knowing that you can't just do this work for the people who look like you, and you cannot ask people constantly for their emotional labor, it is our job to educate ourselves on people who are different than we are, because that is the only way we can leverage our own power and privilege to be good allies and to help amplify other people's stories and voices. It should not always be the job of the oppressed to fix oppression. It should never be their job. Yeah. And so that means I know as a Black queer woman, I have a ton of privilege in other ways. Like I am a college graduate, I am a citizen, I am an English speaker as my native language, and I have to use those privileges to be able to amplify others. And then same in return for people who are cis hetero and straight and white, they have to be willing to educate themselves on the barriers of others so that they can amplify no matter how smart I am, no matter how well educated I am or how well spoken I am, they will never listen to me because I am Black, because I am queer, because I am a woman, whatever it is. And so we have to recognize our own privilege at all times in order to accomplish this work and actually make the thing go. We can talk about it till we're blue in the face, but if we don't actually put some action behind those like great thoughts and warm fuzzy feelings, then we've done nothing.
I just feel like, yeah, I definitely agree with that too as well. But as far as when it comes to diversity and inclusion, a lot of tech companies, how they start up their tech companies is based on their own personal experience, their own personal backgrounds. So for example, like, right, let's say I start up a tech company and it's for a woman. Yes, I probably only want a woman in my tech company, but that doesn't mean that, I'm racist or anything. That's just what I want for my tech company. So if you are seeing that you're a tech company that represents diversity and inclusion, You have to figure out what diversity and inclusion actually means to you. So, and how are you going to invite them to the party? So for me, diversity and inclusion, for me, actually means it's helping fulfill the boot camps, the apprenticeships, etc. It's not more so of the color or anything. Diversity and inclusion means helping these tech companies with the boot camps and apprenticeships. So you might be a tech company that's like, I want all Black males, and that's fine, but you need to figure out what diversity and inclusion. Listen, and I know, Madison, that you say that's not fine, but at the end of the day, you cannot change people when it comes to that, and everybody has their own percentage of diversity and inclusion. So figure out like what the diversity and inclusion actually means to you, right? And then how are you going to invite them to the party? So if you are trying to get Black individuals, how are you going to invite them to the party? And how are you going to keep them to stay at the party? So Madison, how I feel is it's like you can't change everybody to be a diversity and inclusion and make the whole world included when everyone comes from a different background. And what if I wanted to just put all Black women? Is that a bad thing? Or what if I just wanted to put all white women? That's still per se of diverse. You see what I mean? To certain people. What do you say? I would love to hear your thoughts.
You don't. No. So, I mean, so for example, if you're a Black owned company, you still need to create a product that's accessible. And if you create a product that exists for one person, then it doesn't actually work. And so yes, you can go hire a company full of white women and only white women, but you can't also then turn around and say you're diverse, because you're not. So you have a group of people who are exactly the same.
I have learned this with the tech companies. This is like, for example, what if my product is only targeted to white women? Why would I want to have a diverse with Black women and my product is just only to Paris Hilton, etc.? So I'm just going to use only that area of white women, vice versa. I'm not saying I want diversity and inclusion. My perspective of diversity and inclusion is women in tech, because tech is all males. So my diversity and inclusion is all women. Who's to say that I'm wrong because I'm not putting Black people in there? So people just need to understand what diversity and inclusion actually means to that individual, because that's what I had to realize and understand. I've been applying to tech companies that said diversity and inclusion, but that does not mean diversity and inclusion. They were looking for women's, of white women's, and I thought that meant me. So I had to realize that I cannot change these companies at all. I need to figure out what diversity and inclusion actually means to them. Until they realize that diversity is actually a multicultural organization and get more understanding, then you need to understand what diversity and inclusion means to that company, instead of going back and forth until they get the understanding, because not everyone will become woke. And that's what everyone needs to understand. Not everyone will become woke. So in order for you to be safety, you need to realize what tech companies mean for diversity and inclusion from the get-go. And how are you going to retain it?
It's interesting. I'm sorry, Maddie.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, you raise a really interesting point, Eric. And I think there's two things just to differentiate and distinguish so that we're all on the same page. So it's illegal, right, for us to just say we are only going to be hiring white women, et cetera, right? So just from a legality standpoint, it's difficult. I think, however, what you are getting at is this idea that it's naming what our perspective of diversity, equity, inclusion is, and that's fine, and developing the strategy around it and centering it around that. And I'll give myself as an example, okay? And I've received heat from this as well. And I'm also going to say this, that I am a small business, and thereby it's greenfield. I feel like I have a lot more malleability than, say, Fortune 500 companies. And several years ago, I said, I manifest to become the employer of choice for women of color. Okay, and what does that mean to me? What that means to me is that does not mean that I'm only hiring women of color in my organization. But what that absolutely means is that I am centering women of color in my strategy. And you know what? When I do, that means that everyone wins. That means that even the cis white men that I hire also should feel included and belong. Because if I can basically, strategize for some of the hardest of the marginalized in my center, everyone else feels that they feel included in that field. They feel that they belong. And that's where I think the value of naming what you mean is important, because just like the adage says, you won't catch, if you try to catch two rabbits, you won't catch none, right? And so in some ways, I think there really is an opportunity for us to provide a level of focus for the kinds of, communities that we want to support. I know that as a small business for myself, I can only make a very finite amount of investments in my time and my finances. And if I'm going to do so, best believe everyone knows I will be supporting my time and my finances of women and non-binary creatives in my field.
Yeah, and
And
put that in.
I think that's what I think Erica, what you were.
Yeah, because you have to
potentially
put that, if you put I'm looking for Black women, you're going to get a whole bunch of Black women. And that's not what you're trying to say, that you're trying to get a whole bunch of Black women, because you say people of color, that's what you say. So you have to make sure that people understand that it's not particular all color. If you mean all color, that's great, put it on there. But diversity, make sure you understand what that means, so that way that people, when they apply, they understand what the company actually means, and it won't be a miscommunication between you and the person that's trying to apply for your role.
To be fair, though, I also don't think you should be like putting in your job descriptions that we're looking for like just Black women. Like just from like a liability and legal standpoint, we probably shouldn't be doing that. But for me, it's like I've worked with Black owned companies and they run into tons of problems because they've decided to be monolithic. And so then you come into this realm where you've only thought about Black people, but you haven't thought about how you feel about queer people. And so for me, that's the problem, is when you center one kind of person, even like Elena said, she centers women of color, but she doesn't exclude people. And if we start to exclude people in our inclusion, then we've actually done everyone a disservice.
So Madison, to your point, right? And I think, and this is important, right? What I'm hearing overall is there is no one particular yardstick. I think there is a majority practice out there in the world. I think the intent, and then I think the message is too, you don't have to blindly follow the majority practice out there. I think stop, listen, what are you exactly trying to do in the name of inclusion and diversity? Define it for yourself. Take references from outside. It's great. But don't just copy paste what the bigger companies are doing. I'm not going to name them. Don't copy paste it. Sit down, define it for yourself. And then you kind of put the lens on overall inclusion, not excluding anyone in that journey very consciously. I think happens a lot in majority practice. I've been in organizations where we put out in the job description specifically as this is for women to apply. And we've been called out on that too. And I think there's been a lot of learning and unlearning personally that I've had to kind of go through the whole journey of inclusion for myself. I think even our own biases, sometimes we kind of have to tackle in that journey, right? Because what happens is sometimes we get so carried away with what we want and what we think is this definition is. And then we just, and also because I belong to a certain community or underrepresented group over there, then I get carried away with my bias of, hey, this is what I want to do, right? So not excluding anyone in that journey, I think is very, very important.
But I think inevitably, when you have a vision or a manifesto or a story or a video, you're giving candidates an opportunity to self-screen in or self-screen out. And inevitably, right, when we're talking about having a DEI vision in hiring, for example, what that signals, despite the fact that I've been very clear, I manifest become an employer of choice for women of color, non-binary creatives, right? Inevitably, though, that's sending a signal to, if this is a cis white male or a Black male or whomever, of like, just so you know, when you're coming into our space, these are our boundaries. So are you going to be a good ally, and in Yiddish, a good mensch?
Yeah.
Because if you are, I am all for it. And so I would, love to feel and know that my male colleagues very much know what it means to be an ally. Because if you're going to work, for example, at a company like Skill Scout Films, you kind of have to be. And I think that's kind of the level of both boundary setting that I think we're inevitably talking about in the hiring process, that we have these manifestos and these visions is a point of accountability, regardless if you're supposed to be from this marginalized group or not.
Yeah. Allyship, so important, isn't it? I do think personally that in this whole conversation of diversity and inclusion, and then we're totally focusing on marginalized groups, underrepresented groups, and sometimes there is not enough conversation and spotlight on allyship and what it means to even support in this journey. I think there needs to be much more conversations and actions happening on that side of the world of allyship. right, to kind of support with this journey. I think we've kind of discussed on. Charles, were you going to say something? Did you want to say something? I thought you wanted to.
Yeah, just wanted actually to supplement actually on some of those points as well. I think about being deliberate about D&I as well. One aspect is really to set specific headcount for underrepresented, people basically. We're talking about, well, should I only actually hire actually this kind of a person actually for this role and so on. It's completely fine actually to say those 20 headcounts are going to be reserved basically for underrepresented actually people, and therefore we are not going actually to fill them with any other candidates. And I think it's completely legal in most countries. It's completely fine to do that. I think this is where HR would be useful to really proactively say we're not just going to fish, throw a bait, in the water and wait to see who is going to bite. Again, being deliberate is saying, okay, we have 100 headcount, 80 headcount, we're going to actually try our best. And those 20 headcounts, it's not just trying our best. We're going actually to actively only recruit actually these people, again, using actually partners and so on. I think also about, what D&I means for each tech company. So we looked into this, and I think it's really not only a question about company, because it's also a question of country, it's a question of region, and it's a question also of functions as well. You're talking about, for example, D&I in Asia, and very often actually in Asia, in most countries aside from Japan, they will tell you, well, we are great. Actually, we have actually a gender balance, 50-50 male female, and they are doing great. Whereas actually you're looking at maybe Europe, and we're not doing so great actually when it comes to gender. However, when it comes actually to race, then all of a sudden actually Europe actually or the Americas might be able actually to do a little bit better than other countries, for example, like in Asia as well. So when it comes also to sexual preference as well, there are still actually a number of countries where it's completely illegal basically to be homosexual. So I don't think there will be any time one D&I metric that will say, oh, this tech company or this company is doing well or not. I think it will depend on a number of different sub-segments of sub-metrics, and it also actually come down to the region and also the function as well. We know that in tech, for example, programming, for example, as we heard, it was actually until recently quite male-dominated, male-heavy,
right,
and white male, absolutely. Then you're looking, however, in functions where it's more actually client-focused in tech, well, actually, females start actually to get there as well. So I think even the metrics actually to use and the objectives that we set, it has really actually to be more granular. It has to be actually set by country and then actually by function, really to make some sense of that. And again, like I said, I think being deliberate, it's really about also setting headcounts. Unless you have, and again, it's really about being inclusive, unless you have actually said to a certain underrepresented population, you have a seat here, your seat actually is reserved, this is actually not going to work, because you need also to force, the managers inside the company actually to do more than just consider, underrepresented actually applicants, because it's equity. It's not actually giving actually, again, putting in a race actually two individuals at the exact same line and saying well, go ahead and we'll see actually who wins. Well, guess who wins? It's probably going to be someone who looks like actually the hiring manager. And again, with good intentions, there is a bias as well. So we need actually to make it easier actually for those people to get a foot actually into a great tech company, where actually then they can actually grow and develop their career as well. So again, booking headcounts is really critical.
Yeah. Charles, I'm just going to add a quick point of view, and also picking on what Elena has mentioned earlier. And we move on to opening up a quick and seeing if anyone has any questions in the chat, before we come back and have some closing comments, and conscious of the fact that there's been some really good points and discussions out here. I'm just going to share a personal point of view, as I said, is that maybe I'm biased, right? But from experience, I kind of feel that putting metric and working with metric and dashboards and headcount per se, we could be limiting on the impact that we're eventually trying to draw out, that we intend to create on inclusion, rather than, so basically we might be, and again, it's a very personal point of view, where we might be limiting ourselves to the, to the amount of change we could have created if we removed our eyes and lens away from the metric and actually put the lens on this change and transformational change and the DNA, embedding this whole inclusion as a DNA of every single person in the company and the company. Could we have created a larger impact with that lens versus the lens on metric and dashboards and headcount, conscious of the fact that the size of the companies matter too, adding to what Elena said, right? Fortune 500 versus a smaller company by definition, conscious of that. But I do have this very, very strong question on my mind where we're losing an opportunity to create the larger change by the majority practice of putting metrics and numbers and et cetera and quota and all of that, you know?
I'll start with this really quick and then I'd love everyone else's perspective and continue, but I really think it's because there's two motivations with leaders, right? It's like, this is either a company that is bounded by fear or a company bounded by love. You know, that was Herb Kelleher's, right? Southwest Airlines, I would rather build a company bounded by love. And the challenge that we have is for, you know, right now, specifically in tech, people are put on notice. You think that's a company right now that is moving, that is bounded by love? No, they are moving, bounded by the fact that, you know, they feel that they are going to get called out and criticized to do that. And I think that those are very different motivations. And the result, you know, having to put these level of structures and measurements and accountability seems to be important depending on how that company is inevitably motivated. You know, certainly I think that there's a rising number of leaders and emerging leaders who I think have this level of mindset of, you know, driving business by driving good. And I think that, you know, I'd like to think that there are companies who are intentional. I think I'd like to continue to manifest that I could be one of those intentional leaders, but it's really based on two. And I think you're going to be hard pressed, I think, to find folks that have enough self-motivation, self-awareness, and intention to do that without getting measured and held accountable outside of yourself.
Yeah. And anyone wants to add before? Yeah, I do have a point of view, but please, Madison, Erica, Charles.
Yeah,
So
I think, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Madison, sorry.
I was gonna say, I think for me, when we think about what Charles was talking about, my concern around opening up headcount for underappreciated candidates is how are we defining what that means? Are we only defining that by how we look? Are we defining that by, am I a man, am I a woman? Because men and women aren't the only people out there. Non-binary people exist. And how are we making sure that we're including them in our headcount with also not making them have a coming out story every time that they apply somewhere? So for me, I can't think about underappreciated people in only the way of how we look and how our last names sound, because then you leave out a whole slew of other people that exist simply because no one should have to have a coming out story every single time they apply or interview to another job. And so I just have some questions around how do we make our processes accessible and equitable for people who don't fall in the gender binary.
Yeah, and yeah, thanks actually, Madison, for that. And just to elaborate a little bit on that headcount, that example actually, like I shared, we actually set those specific headcounts based on socioeconomic origin. And that basically gave us some very interesting outcomes in the sense that the majority actually of the candidates we've hired actually and our new colleagues are coming from BAME background, BAME background. So it's very interesting because we had also partnership with MyGWork also, and a number of other actually network and partners. And when we looked at that particular campaign, we did well in some areas of D&I, and then we didn't do too well actually, for example, on gender side. We ended up actually hiring actually, more male than female, but we did actually well on socioeconomic. So I think, looking at dashboard and so on, I think it's important at least to set a target, because if you don't set a target, you're going to shoot in the dark, and then you might actually end up with just actually pushing the needle actually by 1% or 2%. But then how are you going actually to bring all the different actually spectrum of D&I inside actually like your strategy and do well everywhere? We are still grappling actually with that challenge. It's not easy. We're trying actually to leverage partnership, but even with partnership, sometimes you do well, for example, on gender, you don't do well actually on race, and vice versa, different on the companies as well. So we're trying to be pragmatic, find the right way as well.
And I just want to touch on that too, because I notice a lot of tech companies are actually doing what Charles said, Madison, to whereas they are having about a couple jobs or just like a boot camp for other represented students. But what happens is they still need to have 2 years software experience. They still need to have 2 years recruiter experience. So you're trying to get underrepresented individuals that still need 2 years experience. So what happens is I have to train these people before they even get to the apprenticeships and the boot camps, etc. So what happens is the role was already fulfilled. The tech company is lost because they can't find underrepresented individuals. They don't have the 2 years experiences. So they do have the jobs, but then they have the 2 years experiences. So I believe that it goes again based on the network that they have. If you have the 2 year experience, if you have the money to go to the boot camp, that's what underrepresented individuals means. That do you have the money to go to a boot camp to get the 2 year experience? Underrepresented doesn't mean like someone that literally has no background to go into the tech company. So I have to go back and to train them in order to get qualified for underrepresentation positions. So I believe that you just have to just narrow it down or find a partnership to where you can train these individuals first before going into the apprenticeships and the boot camps, etc. Because that would happen to me. I live here in San Francisco and went to all these boot camps for underrepresented individuals, Black, and they say you need 2 year experience. And I said, you didn't say that here. You said underrepresentation individuals, you said Black, and I represent all that and inclusion, but you didn't say the 2 year experience. So that's how I believe.
And Erica, you bring a really great point, and it also harkens back to what Madison said, a while ago around VCs, because we have a pretty major conundrum when it comes to startups. They're startups, which means, unfortunately, right, there's this finite amount of time that these leaders feel like they have to get from point A to point B, and whether that's Series A, B, C, whatever, what have you, it's challenging due to the timelines of constantly having to think about the short-term goals. And unfortunately, DEI is not a short-term goal. It's a long-term game. And we certainly aren't giving our startups the runway to truly invest in DEI that needs to happen within these organizations. And I think inevitably the true power dynamic of how that starts to change is going to be through how these tech companies, especially in the beginning, get funded. Because the real gold and the real opportunity, right, Erica, as you're talking about these boot camps, is wow, like a company who can invest from the ground up, and you give that community an investment of 3 years. Those seeds have started to sprout and they're blooming. And I think that really becomes the challenge, is that this is a reward and a wonderful blessing 3 years from now. And our leaders, unfortunately, are only thinking for the 6 months.
And then when you do hire those individuals, make sure you have a leader that can be able to train the underrepresented people, not someone that's been there and working HR that don't know how to communicate to the people that you just hired, or else they're going to leave the company again. So it's just going to be a cycle of retention.
I mean, it's not really shocking. 98% of funding dollars go to straight white men from straight white men, and then 1% go to women and 1% go to everyone else. And so it's not really shocking that startups end up with the same genetic makeup, because you look like where you came from. And so they don't have the capability to wrap their heads around, like, sometimes you have to take a risk on people, otherwise you're not going to get the outcome you want. And sometimes it is a 3-year investment. And I also think, and I'm sure Erica gets it, there's a ton of weird bias around coding boot camps in general, because it goes back to the top talent thing. Instead of just being like, oh, talent is not binary either. Like, you don't have to go to a traditional college. Not everyone has that opportunity, but it doesn't mean you're better or worse because you went to boot camp versus Harvard.
I have my eyes on the comment box, and Molly, please don't be disappointed. I see your comment over there. Maybe you can feel, of course, we can connect. I mean, you can connect with any of the panelists out here to kind of take this forward. It's a very interesting point that you've made. Again, I would say we could take this conversation forward outside of this group too. And I know that we've also kind of reached the top of the hour, and we've been talking for almost 90 minutes. And I have loved the kind of points that we've brought out, and I think it's very it's from different angles and questioning, right? Questioning is important. And I'm going to just share that today. It's my personal point of view, and I'm going to talk as an employee and out of the HR space, really, and from the HR space also. Overall, I think having worked in different companies, over 14 plus years, and also working with metrics, and it's a very personal point of view, and could be very biased in terms of what is working and what is not. But having worked with metrics and dashboards and strategies and all of that, I think today, and when it comes to the company I'm working with right now, and I'm going to talk as an employee and not as an HR person with HackerEarth, a smaller company, Elena, to the point that you had mentioned earlier, not a larger company, giving, conscious of the size. But, I was at a position where I didn't have to, I was very, certain that the next company I join, I'm going to bring my whole self to work. I'm not going to compromise it. I didn't really have to come out per se in the interview. It just felt inclusive. It just felt non-judgmental. I said, I'm going to join. Seems like great people. I joined the company. There is no metric. There is no dashboard. I think also because, it started with one person who's a CEO right now, right? This is one person, right? And that's why I'm very biased to the opinion that we shared over here, saying it kind of started ground up with one person who had the intent to kind of say, respect is important, being non-judgmental about each other's choices, and that respect thereof is important. And that's simple. That can be, out of that, nothing can be tolerated. And that's what it is, right? And we've been lucky. I mean, the company's been lucky to kind of build and kind of sustain a very inclusive culture like that. But I've seen that working. And so I'm very biased today, leading on the whole inclusion chapter, to kind of think that we should do away with metrics. It's harder. It's more difficult, but I think it's more impactful, is my personal point of view. Thank you so much to everyone, Charles, Erica, Madison, Elena, to be a part of the conversation, and I think very honestly and in a very straightforward manner, putting your voice out here and thoughts out here, right? I think extremely challenging, and that's important. That it's a very diverse panel. And that diversity of voices, then of course we knew it would come through, and then inclusion thereof. I think it's important to kind of hear different views and what's working and what not. And thank you to the audience who've joined us today. Again, please feel free to, if you have any questions, sorry that we couldn't really take too many questions, do feel free to send it to us, and we'll see if we can have those questions answered and send it back to you. If the team has a record of all your names in here, okay. But thank you so much for joining. I hope you enjoyed it, and I know it's long, so thank you for the patience and then contributing
time, right?
proactively. Of course, there's always a next time. Always a next time.